Some new rumors are circulating that might finally explain why the price of Bitcoin is stuck at $120,000 per coin. Literally this week, we have seen one of the biggest holders of Bitcoin, the UK government, who is sitting on $7 billion worth of Bitcoin, actually admit that they might sell their 61,000 Bitcoin holdings to pay back some of their national debt. And of course, that's not the only nation state who is rumored to be selling Bitcoin right now. Let's not forget the private investigation that happened in America last week, where we can see Senator Cynthia Lummis came out and said she is alarmed that there are new reports showing that the US has sold over 80% of its Bitcoin reserves, leaving only 29,000 coins. So today I want to break down what exactly would happen to the Bitcoin price if two of the largest nation state holders in the entire world started dumping their Bitcoin holdings onto the open markets. Because I think it's a question that is going through a lot of people's minds right now. Bitcoin just broke above its previous all-time high recently, and it just seems as if it's kind of stuck in this $120,000 zone. We've got high-flying stocks like MicroStrategy still lagging here with, what's this, at $423 per share, and that's not really moving. Bitcoin broke out above that 112K. We're just kind of stuck here at $118,000 per coin. So it would kind of make sense that if the investigation that took place in America recently was true, maybe this can help to explain why the Bitcoin price is just kind of stuck here at $118,000 per coin. So before we get to the new news, breaking down what happened in the UK, this is the third largest Bitcoin holder. Let's have a look at what happened last week in America. Everybody was focused on it being crypto week in Washington. Everybody thought it would be very bullish. Everybody thought that the three new bills that Donald Trump is looking to sign into law, the Genius Act, the stablecoin bill, and the anti-CBDC bill, everybody thought this would be incredibly bullish for the price of Bitcoin. Everybody thought that this would send the price of Bitcoin rallying, but it's stuck. Is it because we might have two of the largest holders of Bitcoin quietly selling Bitcoin? Does this help to explain why the price is not moving? Well, let's break it down in a little bit more detail. We can see Cynthia Lummis, she is quote unquote alarmed by these reports. So let's break down what these reports actually were. We could see the US Marshals reveal that the government only holds 28,000 Bitcoin worth $3.4 billion instead of the estimated 200,000 Bitcoin that most people thought America did hold. So we can see here, this is the private report. It was ran by a little bit of an on-chain analyst. They found that the US is only sitting on 28,988 Bitcoin. This was, again, it was a very controversial report. But again, there's some caveat and there's some nuance that needs to be mentioned in this report. Let's break it down. So we can see here that she is looking at the difference between the seized assets versus the forfeited assets that sits on America's balance sheet. This is, again, a very important distinction that needs to be made. Just because the Marshals is sitting on 28,000 Bitcoin, it doesn't mean that there can't be another portion of the balance sheet that we're not aware of where there might actually be some more Bitcoin hiding, so to say, okay? Again, this is a very nuanced argument. It's a very nuanced debate that's happening right now. But she says, for example, Arkham lists 94,000 Bitcoin from the Bitfinex hack, but forfeiture in the Bitfinex case hasn't been decided. Again, this is a very important caveat or nuance here. So ergo, this doesn't mean that the US government has sold any Bitcoin. It just means that whatever these US Treasury sites estimate is likely wrong. That's the big caveat, as they are not able to differentiate between seized Bitcoin and forfeited coins. Now, again, this is a very important caveat, and I think this is an interesting note to be aware of before we set the stage and start looking at what is going on in the UK. It's very important to be paying close attention to what the UK is doing because they hold 61,000 Bitcoin. Let's dive into this new report that I saw that kind of really surprised me. You can see the date there. This is July 21st. This came out literally yesterday, and it shocked everybody. The UK is working to sell $7 billion of seized Bitcoin to boost the budget. Let's break it down. Let's have a look at what is going on and maybe why the UK could be losing its mind. And let's analyze whether what's happening in America could be influencing what is happening in the UK, because we do know that the US Treasury is allowed to sell the Bitcoin seized by Silk Road, and maybe the UK wants to do something just as foolish. So we can see here, let's jump back on over to this article breaking down what's going on in the UK. The Home Office and the head of the country's Treasury, Rachel Reeves, is working with law enforcement to sell off its stockpile of seized Bitcoin. Why would they do that? Well, it's because the UK can't pay its debt. Its debt is absolutely ballooning, and now they're eyeing, Rachel Reeves is eyeing a $5 billion Bitcoin sale to help plug a black hole. That's an article straight out of the Telegraph. That's the largest lamestream media organization in the UK. Now, what's interesting is we have precedent for what happens to governments and nation states when they sell Bitcoin too soon. Everybody's aware of the German story, but here's one that I don't think you would be aware of. This is, of course, Bulgaria. So Bulgaria sold a ton of Bitcoin back in the day, and look what happened to them. They've absolutely missed out on $25 billion worth of money. So let's break down this story of what happened in Bulgaria before we start talking about Germany and what another nation state in Southeast Asia is doing with Bitcoin. So we can see Bulgaria sold 215,000 Bitcoin way back in 2018. And that is now worth more than its public debt, which has reignited debate over whether government should treat Bitcoin as a reserve asset or not. Because obviously they have been absolutely wrecked. At the time, their Bitcoin holdings was only worth $3.5 billion, enough to cover a fifth of the country's national debt. But they sold the Bitcoin, and now that amount of Bitcoin would be worth $25 billion. That's kind of insane when you think about it. Here's the chart. This is the chart. This is the most embarrassing chart in Bulgaria that I think will be shown, and it'll be in the history books forever. Because again, we are living through the largest government debt crisis of all time. We're seeing nation states all around the world have to come up with all sorts of different excuses as to why they continue to print money while inflation is seemingly, quote unquote, low by our trustworthy government's very own measures. And of course, if you just hold Bitcoin, like Bulgaria could have, they wouldn't have a debt crisis. We can see right here, these are the most indebted nation states all around the world. We can see Sudan in the middle with 252% debt to GDP. Have a look at who else is on that chart. We've got Japan with 235% debt to GDP. We've got the US, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and the Maldives, all with a ton of debt as well. And of course, all of these nations are going to be faced with the same conundrum that Bulgaria was faced with. Just hold the Bitcoin. Why would you sell it? Again, this, I think, is the kind of data that maybe the UK government needs to take a look at. We can see, this is a really cool tweet. I want to break it down for you guys because this could be really interesting to take a little bit of a look at. we can see Bulgaria's national debt, it's massive. But in comparison to this, we can in May 2025, Bulgaria's government debt, $24.5 billion. Bulgaria's 213,500 Bitcoin holdings from 2018, today that would be worth $25 billion. They could literally pay back their national debt. And then we saw this tweet come out of the Bitcoin office in El Salvador. We are not the same. They're buying Bitcoin, one Bitcoin, every single day. Isn't that crazy? I think this is going to be a really insightful lesson, especially when we start looking at what these smaller, more nimble nation states like El Salvador and Bhutan are doing. I think they are going to be the new rising, I want to say first world, but I prefer to use the word rising countries. Okay, and a lot of people think of the world as developing world versus the undeveloped world. Okay, the first world versus the third world. I like to think of things a little bit differently. I like to think of the world separated in two different realms. We have the rising nations, the nations that are making economically rational decisions, like El Salvador, like the Kingdom of Bhutan, like the Czech Republic, as we're going to talk about in a moment. And then we have declining nations. We have Australia, we have the UK, we have where I am right now today, France. We have the majority of Europe, America, Canada. These are the declining nations. And I think over the next 10 or 20 years, what we're going to see is the closing of the gap. Some people think that the gap between the first world and the third world is so large. Maybe if we're talking about Africa, okay, there is still a large gap. But if we're talking about nations like Southeast Asia, South America, Central America, I don't think that gap between these ascending, rising nations and the descending nations is as large as many people think. Again, we do have an interesting rabbit hole to talk about with El Salvador, because we are going to break down the controversy of what exactly is happening in El Salvador in a moment. But I want to talk a little bit more about this story with the Kingdom of Bhutan, because for those who might not know, they are one of the largest Bitcoin holders in the world, despite only having a population of 785,000 people. That's right, not even 1 million people live in the tiny Kingdom of Bhutan. They're one of the smallest nations by population and by economic power. I think their GDP is $2.5 billion. And people will be kind of running the maths. Hang on a minute. GDP, $2.5 billion. Bitcoin holdings, over $1 billion. What is happening? Well, what is happening is this tiny nation that, again, coincidentally, neighbors China, is sitting on $1 billion of Bitcoin. You can see they have 13,000 coins right now. They are the 5th largest holder of Bitcoin. So we've got America, China, the UK, Ukraine, and Bhutan. Again, if these allegations in America are true and they're only sitting on 28,000 coins, and if the UK goes ahead and dumps 61,000 coins, we could be living in a world where the Kingdom of Bhutan could be they could be a top 3 nation state holder when it comes to Bitcoin. Kind of crazy when we break it down and think about it like that. But we can see the Kingdom of Bhutan has Bitcoin holdings worth $1.55 billion. That's kind of crazy when you start thinking about just how small Bhutan is when it comes to its economic power. So if we take a look, we can see the Kingdom of Bhutan has a GDP of $2.89 billion. So that means their Bitcoin holdings is more than half of their GDP. Again, this is what we always talk about when it comes down to game theory and how these smaller nation states, they're going to benefit disproportionately compared to the bigger nation states purely because the size of their country. So these smaller countries like the Kingdom of Bhutan and El Salvador, they can put 50% of their GDP into Bitcoin and go all in and benefit far more than a country like America can. Because think about the sheer size of America. They've got about a $30 trillion GDP. If they wanted to put half of their GDP into Bitcoin, That would represent a $15 trillion investment. And people will be at home kind of scratching their heads once again thinking, Luke, that's impossible. And that's because it is. Because the Bitcoin network today, it's only worth $2.5 trillion. So these bigger, more bloated nation states, they cannot match the investment that these smaller nation states are making into Bitcoin. So that means if Bitcoin continues to grow, these smaller guys like Bhutan or El Salvador, they're going to be able to actually catch up. They are, like I'm saying, ascending. They're going to be closing the gap on these larger Western nation states that have benefited so much over the past 100 years of money printing. They have created this massive gap between the rest of the world purely because they've been living in an economic reality. They've had access to the money printer. These smaller nations don't have access to the money printer, or they're unable to exploit the money printer to the same degree that the Western nation states can. I think that's a rabbit hole for another story. The next kind of thing I want to talk about is how the Kingdom of Bhutan is being able to accumulate 13,000 Bitcoin. That's a massive stack. And I think what's really interesting is that being quietly and privately accumulating these Bitcoin holdings since 2019. There's a really interesting story here to be told about how exactly the Kingdom of Bhutan is getting its Bitcoin holdings to the size where they are today. So the Kingdom of Bhutan, like China, they have a lot of excess hydroelectric power. Again, this is how China also had about 60% of the global Bitcoin hash rate before they banned it in 2021. They were using all of their excess power to buy Bitcoin. And what's really interesting is Bhutan, the fourth largest Bitcoin holder in the entire world right now, has been secretly mining since 2019. This is the kind of this is the stories that I think there are more stories of that I just don't think we've seen released publicly. And that's because mining Bitcoin privately, it's the best way to get your hands on Bitcoin, okay? So many people think that you have to expose your identity to these public exchanges that ask for your KYC information. I don't think you have to do that. I think there are solutions to this problem. And again, the Kingdom of Bhutan, a nation state, clearly showed that there is a solution to this problem, and that is mining, okay? And again, this isn't just something that a nation state could take advantage of. You can actually mine your very own Bitcoin and accumulate a stack of private, non-KYC Bitcoin. I know it sounds a little bit too good to be true, but I'm actually doing it myself. I'm right now today mining with Simple Mining. You can see I have a miner, an Antminer S21 hooked up, and I don't have to take care of the miner. I don't have to worry about any of the electricity bill myself. I am just using the hosted mining service that Simple Mining has. So again, I highly recommend if you are looking for a way to accumulate private, non-KYC Bitcoin that your government is not aware of, I think Simple Mining is a great solution for this. So again, check them out. Everything you need to know to get started mining with Simple Mining is actually linked down below in the description. I think they have a great product. And again, just like the Kingdom of Bhutan, you can accumulate a stack of private Bitcoin that nobody knows you have. Now let's talk a little bit more about what exactly is happening in Bulgaria, because I still have a chart that I think is pretty shocking. We can see Saifedean chimed in on this. All they had to do was just hodl Bitcoin for a few years and then pay off the national debt and stop being a tax farm to pay interest to bankers. Just because it sounds too good to be true doesn't mean it isn't true. This is a great point. So many people think that Bitcoin is hard. It's hard to understand. You know, mining is difficult. Holding Bitcoin is difficult. It really isn't. It's not that hard. And I think we're now starting to see signs that nation states all around the world should have just held the Bitcoin. They should have chilled out, held the Bitcoin, and relaxed. Okay. Again, I don't think I don't think that the world is just able to comprehend just how valuable Bitcoin could be in the future. Now, with all that said, if you do want to learn just how valuable Bitcoin could be in the future, I might put a link to a recent video where I showed you exactly how valuable I think it could be in the future. And with all they said, thank you to everyone who tuned in.